Today, we're going to be discussing the early popes of the Catholic Church and the Vatican's Annuario Pontificio, one of its best-known publications, and how the information from this publication gives us clues into likely Roman provenance for the Jesus story. As many people know, the Pope is the worldwide head of the Catholic Church and head of the Vatican state. Popes have ruled from the Vatican, allegedly since the 1st century CE, ever since Peter is said to have created the church there in around the year 30. Whilst it is claimed that Peter was martyred, his tomb and shrine were supposedly preserved in Rome right up until the 9th century, when they were eventually destroyed. But the important question is, if the Romans despised the early Christians, why was Peter's shrine allowed to survive for so long during the supposedly early years of Christianity? It just doesn't make sense. The Vatican publishes something called the Annuario Pontificio. This is the annual directory of the Holy See of the Catholic Church. It lists the popes in chronological order, as well as all of the officials of the Holy See departments. It's been published annually since 1716, with a few exceptions. It wasn't published in some years, but in practice, it is the Vatican's yearbook. Now, what is really interesting is that the Annuario Pontificio records no less than 5 popes before the end of the 1st century. These were Peter, Linus, Anacletus, Clement I, and finally, Evaristus. Yes, these were all 1st century popes. People that were allegedly popes in the early days of Christianity, when Christians were supposedly being persecuted. Really? Persecuted by whom, exactly? The Romans? The Annuario Pontificio then goes on to list another 10 popes within the 2nd century, and as many as 14 popes within the 3rd century. All of these popes, all 29 of them, were in office, so to speak, before Constantine became emperor and allegedly endorsed Christianity formally. But absolutely none of this makes sense if we are to assume that the early Christians were being persecuted by the Romans. If that were the case, they would not have allowed popes to exist at all, let alone a church dedicated to Jesus Christ. Therefore, logically, what this yearbook openly and unashamedly suggests, even if all the information contained in it might not be entirely correct, is that Rome was in on the act all along. The Annuario Pontificio blatantly signals that far from being persecuted, Christians were in fact in positions of power and influence right from the 1st century. Otherwise, why would they be allowed to have a Vatican and a Bishop of Rome, and how could these entities be formal constituents of the Roman state apparatus? It's inescapable that this points towards Roman provenance for the New Testament, and ultimately, Roman provenance for the creation of the Jesus Christ character. Those who have looked deeply into claims of Emperor Nero persecuting Christians and fiddling whilst Rome was burning already know that these claims were likely made up under the rule of Vespasian, a successor of Nero, and who had a great dislike for him. Given what we've just learnt, we have no choice now but to question all other accounts of alleged Christian persecution, especially given there is no verifiable material evidence of Christians being persecuted. Sure, there are documented claims, but these could easily be fabrications. In fact, contrary to the claims of Christians being persecuted, we have records of Christians persecuting other religious groups from the 4th century onwards. The historical record, covering centuries of conflict between the Romans and the Jews, indicates that the Romans had everything to gain by creating a pacifistic Jewish Messiah. And the Annuario Pontificio merely advances the notion that planning the proliferation of Christianity was a thoroughly Roman endeavor. This is, of course, not absolute proof that the Romans created Christianity, but it is certainly very strong evidence in favor of this hypothesis.